The ice didn't take its hand off the Endurance when spring came. Spring, that would scatter the floes and make an open waterway to the mainland, brought rage to the pack instead. It brought rage to the frost, rage to the winds. The mighty ice that stretched further than their eyesight and further than their imagination came with its greatest force all the way from the Antarctic continent and rammed its head into the hull of the little ship. It was a force more powerful than any. The hardest thing to forget was the noise. Among all things Macklin had ever heard, before and after, the cry of death from the Endurance was the most horrifying. The thunder of the bombs, the groans of those badly wounded, the drumming shots of slaughter didn't tear his mind in the same way. But his darkest nightmares were still haunted by the shouts of destruction from the Endurance. In the strangling grip of the pack ice she wept and screamed and moaned, while her tough planks snapped like matchsticks, while the sea-water came rushing into her chest and put cramps in her heart. She twisted, shivered in convulsions, struggled to get away, but she wasn't allowed an escape. She had to die a sickening death, because what the ice gets, the ice keeps. When they had done what they could to ease her pain, and understood that it was all over, they pitched a little camp thrown out upon the ice. The night was cold, but exhaustion put them to sleep, shaking in the flapping tents. Macklin remembered how he huddled up in Greenstreet's arms to steal a little warmth, while his beard froze to ice in his face. Before he fell into shivering dreams, he could see Kerr crawl up close to Rickenson and Worsley put the sleeping bag over his head. The morning was wet with ice crystals, crackling in their clothes, with stiff limbs and shivers. The morning was gloomy, but Shackleton was standing tall with a straight back, untouchable, unmoved by the weather. He gathered his group around him and explained the situation and the plan with clear honesty in his voice. They would conquer the frozen ocean on foot and find salvation among the rocks at the Antarctic peninsula. It wouldn't be an easy trek across splitting floes and pressure ridges, and they had to leave everything behind that wasn't completely necessary for their survival. Out from his pocket, Shackleton took a cigarette case of gold and several gold sovereigns, treasures for the simple seamen who'd spent their lives on trawlers in Yorkshire. They glittered in the weak sun when he held them in his hand. They glittered when he held them so that everyone could see. Then he threw them into the snow. Macklin did as all of them. He threw away everything that had been so dear to him before, and didn't keep more than what fitted into 2 pockets. He wrapped up his diary in a piece of cloth and hid it nearest to his body. After that he stood on the ice among piles of thrown-away things and noticed that the only thing to see beyond the camp was eternally white. Shackleton was talking to Wilde, and his hushed voice made Macklin listen. Wilde, with his thin hair and his mild, weather-beaten face, stood short and nodded with his hands on his back. He and Shackleton shared something from old times that nobody else could understand. Nobody could understand it, the thing they had brought with them back from Antarctica that time. Nobody could understand it yet. "Frankie," Shackleton said, "it's time for a change of plans. If I can't cross the continent, I make sure to bring all my men back alive." "I get my dog team ready," Wilde replied. It was a chilly night on board the Quest, but the men had gone to bed feeling happy. The evening had been good and the day lovable. Above the glaciers of South Georgia the sun had been standing, and Grytviken had welcomed them. Solitary and frozen was the whaling station, its waters bloody of carcasses, but together with the rough whalers, beneath the mighty mountains, among the houses with rusty snowy roofs, they felt at home. They had walked on grounds that they remembered from the Endurance expedition, and in the snow where they had trained their dogs that time, they played with Query, the pet dog. Hussy had played his banjo for them that night, as merry as he used to be, and Green had cooked strengthening food and sung with his squeaky voice. Kerr had sung too, even though he couldn't sing, and so had Wild, who sounded deep and radiant. Shackleton had watched them with bright eyes, but Macklin hadn't been happy. In his cabin Macklin was sitting when the night was hissing, without being able to sleep. It was impossible for him not to think about Shackleton's pale face and the weakness which he was hiding. He took off his round glasses and scratched his forehead. Shackleton knew that he couldn't lie to Macklin and say that he was healthy, and Macklin had come close to him lately. He had watched over him with his doctor's eyes. He wanted to make him understand that a calmer life would do him good, that it was time to change habits. But Shackleton didn't listen. Shackleton was invincible. When he was called to Shackleton's cabin that night, he felt as if he already knew. The clock struck 2, and he opened the door. It was chilly in the cabin, and in the light from the moon that was creeping over the floor, Macklin could see short puffs of breath rising from Shackleton's bed. He was lying still on the pillow, Shackleton, with one single thin blanket around him. "It's cold tonight, boss," Macklin said tactfully. "Have you no other blanket?" "Yes," Shackleton replied, "but it's in the bottom drawer. I won't bother taking it out right now." Macklin didn't answer. Carefully he bent down and opened the drawer himself, but Shackleton interrupted him. "No, Mac," he said. "Never mind that tonight. Don't you think I can stand the cold?" Macklin had no answer to that either, none that he could utter. Shackleton was too stubborn to be reasonable, so Macklin went to his own cabin, walking through the sleeping ship, and got a blanket from his own bunk. It was a thick Jaeger blanket, one of the same kind as those that had kept the worst cold away when they slept on the ice in the shadow of the Endurance. Every blanket had been wet and thin back then, but now this one was warm and comforting. Shackleton did nothing when Macklin tucked him in, and he didn't pretend to care. The moon shone on his pale eyes. Quietly Macklin was sitting after that, looking at him. Minutes walked through the cabin in the moonbeam, and years walked through their thoughts. A clock was ticking. The waves rolled. "Perhaps it'll be the best," Macklin finally suggested, "if you take it a little easier in the future." "You always want me to give up something," Shackleton sighed. "What is it that I ought to give up now?" His voice was feeble. Macklin was sitting peacefully in his chair and saw the moonlight climb up the wall. The clock was ticking away time. The waves rinsed the hull of the Quest. He turned towards Shackleton to break the silence, but no puffs of breath arose from Shackleton's bed. Only the moon was shining.